So we'll give it a few seconds as the attendees roll in. There's normally a sort of a little bit of time as the list gets updated, and then we'll start with some of the introductions of this all-star panel. We were just before we joined the live webinar, we were chatting about Halloween stories from yesterday, and Jackie had in a non-intentional way scared a few kids away, so we're probably not going to have a lot of time to talk about that during the session today, but to the extent we need a moment of comic relief, Jackie has that lined up for us.
Oh, great.
That's how she preserved her candy stash. Low, just scare them away.
Yeah. You know, I like to see those 8 and 9-year-olds petrified, you know, running through gardens and stuff. It's pretty funny.
And many of them have stories to tell today, and
That's cool. The crazy lady at that house.
without all the background necessarily. So what I will do, just for the sake of timing, and then as people roll in, we can dive into it. Like I'll give a quick synopsis as the different panel members engage. So I'll start with a brief introduction of myself, and then I will ask Caitlin, Elsa, Jackie, and Mo to introduce themselves afterwards in that order as well. So my name is Gary Kalassi. I'm the CEO at Alexa Translations. We, as you know, we do a lot of work in the fund space, and we thought, with all the changes happening in the regulatory space and some of the changes that are coming, hearing from some of your colleagues some of the best practices out there, it would be a very useful exercise. One thing we realized during the practice session, there was so much to say within this group that we said we're going to do an encore in the new year. Now, one thing we'd encourage the audience to do, I know many of you are watching this as a recording afterwards, and you indicated that, but to the extent for those of you that are following us live, to the extent you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I'll moderate them and ask our panel, especially as I tie it into the various topics that we're talking about. So on that note, I will introduce Caitlin first. And Caitlin Gosage, and I said it the very French way. So Caitlin, I will pass the virtual mic on to you.
Thank you so much, Gary. I'm thrilled to be a part of this panel. I now know everybody on this panel, which is exciting, and I hope I know some people in the audience. I'm working as Chief Compliance Officer and VP of Operations at Fourth Lane Investment Management. I've been here for a little over 2 years, and this firm services high net worth families and individuals and provides pension-style investment fund solutions. So my work is in obviously making sure those are compliant and then helping structure and launch products. Prior to that, I was at Purpose Investments in a hybrid compliance and legal role. And before that, I spent 5 years at BMO in various compliance roles, which was great, including CCO for the asset manager, for the Canadian asset manager. And I started many moons ago as a lawyer at Osler before pivoting to the business. So thrilled to be here. Thank you.
And for background, Caitlin, Elsa, and Mo are all lawyers. Jackie grew up in the compliance space altogether. Is not a lawyer, but all the lawyers that we have here are all very nice people. I promise you that. So Elsa, I will, if you could introduce yourself next, please.
Sounds good. So I'm Elsa. I'm General Counsel of CI Investments. I've been here for about, 11, perhaps 12 years now. And so CI is my first foray into this industry. Prior to that, I articled at Osler's, and then most of my early career in Hong Kong at Freshfields. I really did happen to just chance upon this opportunity at CI. So I'm happy to be here and to share whatever thoughts I might have on the topics that we discussed today.
Thank you very much, Elsa, and Jackie next.
Thank you. Yes, I too am pleased to be a part of this panel. I admit to not being a lawyer and to being an accountant, clearly not a practicing accountant.
Practicing lawyer either, so it's okay.
Yeah. I've been around in the industry a very long time. I started my career at what is now PwC in Luxembourg on investment funds and the UCITS. I moved to AGF, where I was the chief compliance officer, anti-money laundering officer, and privacy officer. I then left and went to Caldwell, and am now managing director of the risk and compliance solution at a large consulting firm called Protivity, which is owned by Robert Half. And now I service the industry in this space.
Thank you very much, Jackie. I think your perspective wearing both hats is going to be helpful today. And last but certainly not least, Mo.
Nice for you to say, sort of least, but I'll take it. So I'm Mo Asadi. I head of legal and compliance for PIMCO Canada. I've been here for about 3.5 years. Actually came over from CI, where I previously worked with Elsa. Started my career in private practice at Blake Castles in Graydon, where I was a securities law associate, before moving to the Ontario Securities Commission, where I spent about 6 years in the investment funds and structured products branch before kind of moving in-house. So kind of seen the industry from all angles, but super excited to be here, join this panel for this important discussion.
Elsa still has not forgiven Mo for leaving CI, but on jokes aside, Mo's perspective, having worked for a regulator in the past, is going to also be very important as we go through the session today. So on that note, I'm going to start with the first topic. And one thing that, and we discussed this with the panel during the practice session as well, is there's a lot of golden nuggets of information that came from this group. And we said, look, we like the free flow, we'll sort of pose some questions for them to run with, but that ultimately the group can feel free to jump in as needed. And any questions that come from you, like I said, I will entertain and introduce throughout the session today. So the first one was, this year was, and the deadline has already come up, but the prospectus and AIFs were being combined, and that resulted in a lot of procedural changes or internally measures that you were taking to actually get to the finish line and what that looked like. To the extent that some organizations are out there are still working on it or are improving their process around it, what suggestions would you have for them? And perhaps I'll pose it to Elsa and Mo first, and then really open it up to the group beyond that.
Sounds good. Maybe I'll take this one first. So yeah, I'm lucky enough to be supported by a few lawyers on my team. And so in order to save on external counsel costs, we did try to attempt to do a first draft in-house. And they did an amazing job. They went through all the changes and just slammed the two things together and make notes to draft for us to all discuss, and also for external counsel to take a look at to see whether we were on the right track. We were quite very interested in getting this done, just because that's 2 documents into one, and we actually have 8 different families to renew for. Well, some of it was ETF, so it wasn't impacted, but any savings here we were very welcome to take. And so we were so keen that we started in January. And then by February, we passed it to our external counsel. And then by that time, we were able to take that first draft and just dub it for the few, or I think it was 5 or 6 renewals after that. And so, yeah, I would suggest, that if there's cost constraints, things like that, I'm pretty happy with our product. And so more than happy for you guys to take ours and see whether that can be helpful to you as a good base. And I think Mo also and I also talked about this during the process. And what I learned from Mo was there's actually additional things that we could do for next year, such as, I think you mentioned exemptions that were repeated kind of in the front part A, and then repeated again for the fund specific information part B. I think next year I'll try to even tweak that a little bit more so we're not being so repetitive.
Yeah, I mean, I totally say, I think one of the places, lawyers can really add value here, even if you're a firm like ours, which kind of outsourced it to outside counsel, it is precisely that. There is a lot of places where the form still has repetition, or you might, as Elsa mentioned, have exemption orders. But I think kind of the philosophy I've approached with prospectuses, which frankly are first and foremost a liability document and a document you file with the regulators that kind of officially says what you're doing, and probably secondarily, if at all, kind of a document an investor would read. My general view is kind of say things once, say it right, and don't repeat it multiple times, especially, sometimes people will repeat it in slightly different ways. That can only potentially create issues for you. I think anywhere as a lawyer can find, just put it in, say it once, and just say it right.
Thank you, Mo. And one sort of follow-up question along these lines is, how did this move affect the cost? Like, did this actually make your lives easier? I think the intention was to actually reduce some of the work that counsel has to do on this, and compliance team members. Was that the actual result? What were how did it affect the costs ultimately?
I think there were lots of time that was actually saved. One of the tables we always struggled with was the significant shareholder section. This is where we get a giant spreadsheet from IT, and you're trying to figure out whether we got the right information, whether the right parameters were set up, so we can flow it into the prospectus. And part of that role was also, we don't want to show John Smith on the table, and so then you go through the process of going investor 1, 2, 3, and it was just a giant waste of time. So from a time perspective, we definitely saved a lot of time on that one. But because the merge actually required quite a lot of work, we actually spent more time renewing this year. But I can imagine going forward, now we have one less document to deal with, and then one less document that we have to hand to you, Gary, for French translation. So I think it's going to be a lot of time saved going forward.
Yeah, exactly. I think it was large cost upfront for this year. Kind of consolidating the documents. It's almost difficult to overstate like how labor intensive a task it was, something that seems so easy, but actually to merge them. But I still think, while, yeah, I think it's great. And I think we're going to save, time and money going forward. There are still places for improvement. There are still things in the prospectus or the fund facts that, are really kind of point in time data points. The trading volume and prices for ETFs, for example, which, in my mind, really do reflect requirements that come from an earlier era where maybe this information wasn't as available to investors, and they could only figure out what trading history had been by looking at a prospectus or collecting a bunch of newspapers and flowing through them. Now you can go on Google Finance and kind of find out all the information you want in real time. Kind of makes me question the value of having 12 months stale, and keep in mind your prospectus is also good for another 12 months, so you could have 20 months stale information. Who's that really useful for? But from our standpoint, it's still labor intensive to collect that information, to compile it, and to make sure it's right. Because at the end of the day, it is a liability document. You want to make sure the information you put out there is correct and accurate. I just question whether on a cost benefit, there isn't still more that could be done.
So that lays it out nicely, Mo. That's a question that I wanted to ask the group: is what does that future state look like? What would you like to see as changes coming up, whether from regulators, whether it is practices from sort of your colleagues in the industry that can help give this some direction that makes it more manageable, and manageable not strictly from a compliance perspective, but also so that the end users, as all the investors, can get the information that they need versus just something for the sake of checking a box. And feel free, I will perhaps open it with Caitlin and Jackie, and then the rest of the group can feel free to jump in.
Jackie, do you want to start, and do you want me to jump in?
Sure. I mean, at the end of the day, the reality of it is that, do investors even read this document. I know what it's intended for, but we all know it's a small few that do. We also know that investors, and certainly from the very recent surveys that the commission has published, in terms of investor sophistication and their knowledge and awareness about funds and risk and market risks, et cetera. No two investors are alike. And I think this document, while the concept made sense to reduce, the books, let's call it, and simplify it, there's just still, it's just too much information. I mean, they are still, I don't care if you part A, part B, part C, however you divvy it up, there's just too much information in there. And exactly as Mo said, some of it is so stale and not relevant. What's the point, right?
Can I add on that too? I liked his term about it being a liability document, because you, as the fund manager, still have to have it perfect, and you have people now who troll these things to see if there's any mistake. It's not actually an investor necessarily, or it is, but it's somebody whose full-time job is just looking for errors to send you a complaint to get some kind of a payout on it. So it has this kind of perverse outcome when it was originally intended to protect people. Query whether it's actually doing that. Yeah, I just think your comment that it's a liability document is so perfect, because it's not really proactive for people. They can find that information anywhere.
Yeah, and truthfully, just on that front, when you, and I've done this exercise, pick any sort of generic fund, like a plain Jane Canadian equity fund, for example. If you pick up most fund companies' description of the strategy, it's almost the same.
Yeah.
Like the 2 or 3 paragraphs that are in there, it doesn't give you really much information. They're the same, whether, whatever brand you put on it for the fund manager, and the performance numbers can be radically different. Like there's not enough, I think, relevant information, and there's too much, I don't want to call it superfluous, but almost superfluous information, right? That's just not relevant at the point of making that investment decision. And I think the regulators need to revisit the document. I think there needs to be a document, but I'm just not certain that even the combination is still relevant for today's market.
What tips and tricks would you sort of share with colleagues out there in the industry, having gone through this particular change, combining prospectus and AIF, but also sort of any of the tips and tricks that have you found particularly useful over the last couple of years with the most recent changes overall? And the maybe I'll start with Mo first on this one. And then I know the Elsa has a team supporting. So the next question I'll ask after that, just to give you some thought, is when you have a team supporting you, obviously it's a little different. It gets sort of a separation of duties, but then you have many organizations where you have sort of one counsel, and sometimes they don't even have in-house counsel supporting these activities, and what that could look like, and what support systems could be out there, especially for more junior lawyers or junior compliance roles. So that's the second question. But for now, just tips and tricks on complying with these changes.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I call this a tip or trick. I think it's somewhat out of necessity. I mean, unlike Elsa, we're a very small kind of team in Canada at PIMCO. So a lot of the work I have to outsource to outside counsel and then kind of oversee it. I think my general approach is always, if you do have limited resources, you almost have to prioritize what are the disclosure points here that are probably the highest liability or highest risk from your standpoint. Things around fees, MERs, even performance numbers. Those are things where, I think the regulator and, potentially investors would take it quite seriously if there was a material misstatement. Whereas, maybe other things less so. I mean, I think Jackie made an interesting point about the investment strategies. It's always a bit of a gray zone how investment strategies should be disclosed, because as you guys know, with kind of 81-102 kind of retail mutual funds, you're not allowed to change the investment objectives without a vote of the security holders approving it. But you can change strategies without a vote. And then the query becomes, well, can you just change it on the fly, even though your prospectus says you'll do one thing in the strategy? Is, well, what if 6 months in, I decide to do something different? Do I have to go back and amend it? Or was that disclosure only accurate as of the date of the prospectus? And it's kind of understood PM has flexibility to move that around. I suspect that view is why we see the disclosure be the way it is, which is people try to be as general as possible, give as few specifics as possible, because I think it then raises the issue of, well, if the PM decides they want to change a percentage allocation somewhere, do we have to go back and do a whole refiling and a whole amendment? I have a personal view on it. I'm not sure, I'm not sure we've ever gotten kind of a definitive answer here, but yeah, I think that kind of be my, if you can call it, tips and tricks.
Thank you, Mo. Elsa, feel free if there's anything to add. Otherwise, I do want to really ask the group on sort of strategies that can be shared, to knowing that the limitations that some of the teams have, having just one counsel or sometimes not having in-house counsel, and what could be done and what the support system could be like within the ecosystem. So Caitlin, can I pick on, we'll move to the second question. I'll pick on you for this one.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was being called on. I thought you were talking to Elsa for a second.
No, it's, I wanted just an opportunity in case Elsa had something else, but we can always circle back if something comes.
Oh, I can talk about small firms, definitely, and small departments of one. So I totally agree with, I actually think Mo's comment makes sense kind of across the board. If you feel confident, especially if you're junior, and it's hard to know sometimes if you don't have kind of experience dealing with some of this stuff, what's really material. But thinking about what is kind of your most material, information that's out there that people are going to be looking at, and trying to prioritize that first. With the changes that went through, I guess, 18 months ago, and you're talking about conflicts, for example, what's your most material conflicts? There's lots of conflicts, but what are the ones that if someone's looking at your firm, they're going to say, gee, that one looks pretty glaring. I wonder what they're doing to deal with that, and go backward from there. And then the other thing I would say, which I'm sure Jackie will add on to, is the group itself, the compliance group has always been, in my experience, extremely forthcoming with information, extremely generous with their time. And I don't know why that is, if the people that gravitate to this role are just nice people, or if they're so used to people within their firms not liking them that they need to find friends elsewhere who deal with the same stuff day in and day out. It's probably a combination of both, but either way, more power to you. So you can probably reach out to anybody either attending this session or on this panel, and they're usually pretty available to talk about how they've approached something. No promises, but at least you can have some consistency with someone else in the market, hopefully.
Yeah, and I would echo that. Having a network and people you can talk to, even if it's a sounding board, right? Like, I think I want to put this together. Sort of Mo talked about not replicating certain disclosures. I think that's just, it's good to be able to have somebody that's not on the dime, like your external counsel at, ludicrous amounts per hour to talk to. The other thing I would say is, fish around, and this is really because Caitlin had made the comment about what's material. If you fish around your own sort of website and your own other disclosures unrelated to these offering documents, you've built a story around potential conflicts, or just things that happen in the company, also about the investment strategies, about particular funds. You need to make sure it's consistent. you will get those trolls, as I think Caitlin called them, that will say, wait a minute, you know, on the website in your little fund summary document or whatever it's called, you say this about your fund. You also say the CIO is a salesperson and a wholesaler, and, you know, this, that, or whatever, and yet you're completely silent on these topics in your offering documents, for example. So I would sort of try to take a critical lens at what you already put out there, right? Be it for marketing, be it on the website. Even it's amazing how much a PM discloses when they're on BNN or any of the other shows, let's call it. You just, it's really important, I think, to pay attention to that. And then, as Caitlin said, using that sounding board to just talk through your logic with somebody who gets it. You know, they may not know your circumstance, but they are wearing that same lens. They're going through the same process you are, or maybe, as Elsa said, did it early in the year, and you can benefit from their struggles or their experience.
Hopefully they just send you their stuff.
And then, you know, I would say involving your auditors, because remember, you do need them to sign off on these documents. The more people that you can engage early on to get feedback, I think is important.
Yeah, I wanted to, if it's okay, just comment on that. Jackie, you mentioned that before. I remember talking about the cost, the runoff cost, or the run-on cost, I should say. And audit isn't something that I had to think about a lot in my other roles, but I have to think about it all the time in my current role because of some of the stuff that I'm doing. And it is, every time you change something, it's a new conversation, to your point, and a new kind of educational process to get them up to speed so that they're comfortable to sign off in the time frame that you're allowed from year end. And it's so every change has that kind of, you know, incremental effect. And
correct.
It's just something that to be aware of. I don't know that everybody who is thinking about the rules kind of in their infancy thinks about that.
Correct. And I would throw out, and I think both Elsa and Mo alluded to it, when you have your, you know, new documents, and they need to be translated, it's another place dealing with the auditors. How things were said in the audited financial statements, the terms, the descriptions, they need to align. So if you're going to change it, you better have the auditor sign off on it, because it's going to have to flow through to your financial statements. And these are things that traditionally, certainly council doesn't think about it because they're focused on, you know, the SP or the AIF, but you as the IFM, whether or not as a CCO, it's in your sort of bailiwick or responsibilities, you, the manager, have to deal with it. These are documents that have to come together. They are talking about the exact same product. They need to use common terminology in English or French, or if you translate it even in another language, it needs to be consistent. And so anytime you know, muck about, so to speak, with one of those documents, you've got to think about all the downstream effects to all those other documents that'll eventually, at some point in a 12-month cycle, right, be affected.
No, 100%. I would add to Jackie's point about making sure all documents align. And you know, this year they were focused on ESG funds and disclosure. And you know, we changed the strategy so then, you know, we can better align with what they wanted to see. But then, you know, another question we would get from USC is, can you show me your marketing documents, right? So, you know, to both your points, we really have to make sure that, you know, one change here actually has many impacts across the board, including marketing documents.
Yep.
Yeah, and
including the verbal, right? Like what the PMs are saying. People are so used to your original documents, right? That's the story they spun originally. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but that's what they were used to saying. You change that, it's got to filter even to the verbal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Sorry,
I was going to, yeah, no worries. No, I was just going to say that I think this kind of holistic approach kind of indicative of the need to have the various teams inside your firm talking. Because I know, sometimes, the lawyers do the prospectus and fund facts. You might have a fund reporting team or an accounting team that does the financials, MRFPs. You have a marketing team doing the marketing documents. And sometimes these things can become siloed. And I think that's where you land into kind of these situations where, the OSC might do a prospectus review and then ask you, well, I want to see all the marketing docs. And suddenly there's a misalignment, or maybe you weren't aware of necessarily what was in the marketing documents. So there is a real need to make sure, those teams are all talking. And I think, for better or worse, legal oftentimes tends to play that kind of point person role of kind of, making sure, everything's consistent and said correctly.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good point. Sorry, Gary, just to add to that, and I've seen this in my past, MRFPs, the little paragraph that we all get portfolio managers to write about how the fund did. And sometimes they give some pretty detailed information, which can be conflicting to the strategies that you've disclosed in the prospectus. So to Mo's point before, where we don't want to, give too much detail in the strategies, sometimes we give it so vaguely. Like the best example I can give is 70-30 allocation, like very broad ranges. And all of a sudden in a descriptor, there'll be, and we took a 50% bet in X. And you're like, whoa, you've just disclosed something that's inconsistent with the document we wrote 8 months ago, right? Or whatever it is. Yeah. And so I will just throw out that I think there needs to be an understanding that, and this goes back to your point, Gary, on where do we go in the future, or at least regulation. There's just so much we have to give investors about the fund in different forms over the course, of a 12-month cycle, but it all talks about the same thing in multiple different ways. And it can be confusing, it can be daunting, and then sometimes conflicting. And that just needs to be figured out much better.
Can I just jump on that? I think, to be clear, we're obviously in this context talking about the so-called kind of retail client who's getting an 81-102 fund or something similar. And obviously, once you get into the exempt market space, there's a bit more flexibility. But at the end of the day, all of these rules are about investor protection and trying to provide as much information as possible, or as much disclosure as possible, to the end user who might not be, quote unquote, that sophisticated. And maybe they aren't that sophisticated. But I think in some instances, the documents, the way they get written now, as a function of all of these other kind of unexpected consequences of the legislation, mean that they're not really meeting that end goal, which we have said on this panel before, and lots of people have said. But it's having a real impact now, where the end user doesn't have access to kind of products that might really benefit them, because they're really limited in what they can be offered based on a lot of these rules. And I think that's unfortunate. I think about our products here, which are for obviously the high net worth client, and they are, up, I think 1% over the course of the year, which isn't very much, but if everything else is down 15%, that's pretty good. And I feel that in some instances, a retail client would really benefit from a product that had low volatility and low correlation, and maybe just was pretty safe, but they're not allowed to have access to a lot of that because of the run-on implications of a lot of these rules, which is sort of an unusual outcome. And I don't know if that's what people wanted when they were thinking about it. Hope I'm not stepping out too far, but
no, and that's fair, right? Because I think at the end of the day, it needs to be said that the concept of investor protection obviously is the right role to be played, but there are many ways to do that. And it seems like here, at least in our context, it's been dealt with in two manners. One is, just disclose ad nauseum, tons and tons of information. But on another one, it's almost like, let's give every bucket of investor a sandbox, and they can only play in that sandbox, regardless if they have unique circumstances or have funds that they can risk at loss, or, you know, whatever their circumstances are. And it's kind of ironic, in my view, because the regulator has also regulated the people who can manage the funds. And if they're so proficient and under so much regulation, let them decide what's right or not, and pick either disclosure or pick the sandbox concept. But I think you're absolutely right that our rules right now are sort of protecting people that maybe don't need protection, or overprotecting individuals. It's almost like that commercial with the kids that are wrapped in bubble wrap, you know, because the mom's afraid they're going to scratch their knee and the whatever. Like, we need to recognize. Yeah, well, and
they're totally safe.
It's like I sit here and say, an individual can spend months and months and months researching to buy a car or, you know, some other big ticket item, and they don't get this level of protection. Yeah. And here it's been decided that they can't do things on their own, and they need to be hit with all of this extra protection.
And I think even just I obviously, you know, that I agree with you on this, and even, you know, the ideas in principle behind some of these rules, which maybe aren't formally written, but have kind of become market practice. Like the idea that you'll want to meet every client that you know, in person. I know that's not technically required, but a lot of managers feel that that's required because that's kind of been the prevailing wisdom for a very long time. And depending on what your strategy is, people will feel more comfortable, you know, PMs feel more comfortable doing that. They want to do that. Well, what does that mean? If you have a really great portfolio manager, you're going to be limited in who they can meet because of the time constraints. And then you're going to be, by extension, limited in how much money you're willing to accept from somebody. So someone with $5,000 isn't going to get access to that manager because it's not worth his or her time to meet with you. And so you inadvertently exclude people, even if that's not the intention, because of market practice itself. Nobody wants to veer. I think it's safe to say everyone on this panel and most people listening to this panel are good actors or trying to be good actors. So they're wanting to veer toward what's consistent and what is kind of the market norm. And the market norm is very intense. It's conservative. So, you know, you run up against limits because of it.
I love the passion in the discussion so far, and it's part of what established the as we were doing the practice session. We said, look, we're going to need another one in the new year because there's so much to talk about. There's one small thing I wanted to get back to, just in the event that we have some more junior compliance team members or in-house counsel or new to the industry. I know we talked about this compliance network, but to what extent do you think the people in the industry are open? I know this panel was open to it and in fact offered that you can reach out to them at your convenience. But the thinking is there sort of this, I can't tell you too much because I'm worried about the competition versus actually being pretty open about saying, here's some nice, here's some things I wish I knew when I got into this space, and here's what could make your life easier by doing it without necessarily giving away the farm from a competitive perspective.
Yeah, I can take a first go at this. I have said this before, but one of my old bosses always said that you don't compete on compliance because all of the rules are the same, and it's just about tailoring your approach from a business standpoint. So my philosophy on it has always been, you're not competing on it. And if you have something that worked for you and you have a colleague in another competing firm that could benefit from it, it's probably, you know, that's not really the secret sauce that's going to change your life, because at the end of the day, you know, a policy or some kind of tracking Excel spreadsheet is super helpful, and they probably have too much on their plate anyway if they're asking you. It's my guess. So this is me thanking everyone who's ever provided me with anything since I'm in this. But yeah, I don't think you compete on it. So that's part of it. I think people are pretty forthcoming because, you know, it's a hairy space and it's hard to walk that line where you're supporting your business as best you can, but keeping them, on side, perfectly within the bounds of what's a market practice, because that's changing. The market evolves. That's the difficulty. The market's always evolving.
So to anyone listening live or they will listen to the recording afterwards, do reach out to colleagues in the industry. It is really the only way to lower the learning curve. And despite what you may think preliminarily, there's a lot of people are open-minded to actually talking to you about this.
Sorry, Gary, just on that,
please.
what's important to understand too is when the regulators, come out and look at registrants, right? They're doing their regular reviews, whether those are sweeps, etc. They're really trying to understand how is the industry taking these rules, which in some cases are not prescriptive. They define sort of the sandbox concept that I was talking about. And how are they applying them? How are they interpreting them? And it's important, I've always said, every firm has its own risk appetite, but you want to be somewhere in the curve, in the middle of the pack. You clearly don't want to be at the end because you're going to get called out for it. And if you don't have the stomach for the higher risk, you may not necessarily be out front either, because you're either being excessively conservative or hugely risk-taking in terms of how you are applying stuff. So even for the purposes of gauging sort of your application, your interpretation of whatever rule it may be, it's important to have this network of peers. And I would say not just like peers, but, like I look at Elsa's firm, for example, where the large firms have the suite of everything, whether those are exempt products, exchange traded funds, regular plain vanilla funds. The more you can get insight and intel on how the various different participants are applying rules, I think it just better informs you. Plus, it makes you a better CCO, or at least compliance professional, because you really are understanding the market, right? And what is acceptable on the street.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree with that. I think sometimes what happens is, people are a little worried, like, well, what if I tell Elsa what we do? And then when she gets an OSC audit, she's like, oh, you guys think what I'm doing is bad. You should go look at what Mo's doing. Everybody's always a little bit like, oh, I don't know what I want to say. I actually always thought it would be a huge service to the industry if an industry group or something did periodic kind of anonymous surveys of, like, for example, sales practices. What are the limits other people are working at? That way nobody has to feel like, oh, I let somebody in under the hood, which could expose me in an OSC review or something. But, everybody could get the information, because I actually think this is an area where, fund companies, you compete and you make money on strategies, maybe even on, operations or back office efficiencies, but you're not competing and making money off compliance, which I think is a comment the other panelists have made. So I think it would be a huge benefit if kind of everybody knew what the industry standard was, because in the absence of that, it becomes rumor. Oh, I heard so-and-so's doing this, they're doing that. And I think it would just be a big help for everybody. And I think, to Jackie's point, you never want to be on either extreme. When it comes to compliance, you want to make sure you're right there in the middle. So.
Well, and Caitlin brought up something during the practice session, where she said sometimes it could be somebody in the industry saying, we're about to enter Quebec, like, what, and for some of you, you've done this over, it may be second nature because you've done it many times and with multiple products, etc. But for somebody doing it for the first time, it can seem so daunting, just the sort of new rules, obviously language requirements, etc. So sometimes it could be as simple as, you're not giving away the farm if you're giving them some tips on here's how, like, when we entered Quebec, here's some of the things we did. And perfect example of something that anyone could reach out to this group with as well.
You're going into Quebec, use Alexa.
That's always a tip that we condone, but
Well, and that's a good point, because, you know, that equally applies to funds where somebody is always first at bat, right? Somebody launches that first ETF, that first type of strategy, you know, whatever that product is. Like I remember, you know, purpose. Anyways, I'm just to go back to the point that Mo was making. I think if you have this network and somebody has figured something out, being able to pick up the phone and calling, I'm picking on you, Elsa, just because of CI, but calling Elsa or calling whomever, right? You're now getting into the fixed income space. Go call a fixed income manager, compliance officer. You're not giving away the secret sauce, and in fact, you are also sort of supporting defining how to apply certain rules. Because let's be honest, the regulator is thinking not necessarily in the practical perspective in terms of how you can functionally make all these rules work. They don't have the knowledge and insights of how the fund accounting systems work, you know, how operations work, how the PMs filter and pick stocks. Like they don't have this practical vision. So the fact that you can work alongside of each other and figure that out and sort of develop, sort of as Mo said, kind of what's the standard right now? What's the prevailing sort of acceptable method to apply this rule? It's important because we all know the regulator has sometimes got it wrong, and they have published subsequent guidance or staff notice to give more clarity. And that's come from the industry coming together, right? And making it clear to them that, well, the only way we can do that particular rule or that particular requirement is in this manner. And if that's not what you intended, you either change the rule or you give us more explicit guidance, right?
Yeah, I would take, go ahead, Gary.
No, go, please.
I was just going to say that practical experience is so valuable. And I think you're right that in our, although Mo might disagree with me because he's actually worked at the regulator, but my sense is that, you know, on the regulatory side, you have a lot of really bright people, but they're thinking about this in kind of this theoretical universe. And it's very beautiful in this theoretical universe. And then if you have to have a conversation, and I have the same conversation with external counsel, to be honest, who also live in a really beautiful theoretical universe. And, you know, they're like, well, this, and it says you have to have that discussion where you say, okay, if you're going to insist on this, then what that means is this, and then this. If that's not what you think is reasonable, or if that's not the intended outcome, then we need to revisit that initial idea, because it's not going to play out the way you're thinking it is. And that's, I think that's maybe a dialogue that we could use more of in this market, in this country, or in Ontario, I guess, if this is where we are. You know, it sometimes feels like it's a little one-sided. It would be helpful to have more of a nuanced discussion about some of it, I think.
So Caitlin, I'm going to pick up on just on that last point you made. So Canada has been able to do many firsts, but the sense in the industry is that from a regulatory perspective, it's still struggling. It's not quite sort of up to date, and often the sense is that the regulator sometimes is acting like the portfolio manager. So to the extent that you could give, let's say we had a bunch of regulators listening to us today, and to the extent that we want to give them some tips, here's how you could make our life easier, or the industry easier. And this is to all of you, not, I'm just picking up on Caitlin's last point, but not to put Caitlin on the spot, but really, if you were to say, and by to any of the audience members, if to the extent that you wanted to sort of ask a question in this regard, or any comments, please feel free and I'll introduce them. What would you say, like what can regulators do? And we know, for example, there's this proposal around the prospectus being filed every other year as being considered right now. So what is the sentiment around that, and then what would the messaging be?
I have a very specific idea about what I think would be great, which I have sort of already said, which is that I believe that retail investors, it's obviously somewhat selfishly motivated because that's me, You know, it would be nice if there were a way to more easily access some of the alternatives that have been the exclusive domain of the exempt market. And they were the exclusive domain for lots of good reasons when they first came out. I think we didn't have a ton of experience with them. We weren't that sure how they were going to operate. And we can now see that in a market where you have a lot of volatility, or you have rising interest rates, or the stock market is falling, that they can provide a safe haven for assets. I'm not saying all your assets, but maybe some. And it's really difficult as a retail investor to find access to that. There's just no reason for a experienced portfolio manager to provide it. But this is the pension fund model. That's what we've been exporting all around the world. Other countries want to copy us because we do that really well. So it seems odd that we don't allow the people who would arguably benefit from it most, other than teachers, I guess they technically have access to it through their pension, but everybody else, there's no products that you can buy that have exposure to it in a real way. So to me, the prospectus every other year, it's still a prospectus with a lot of requirements, a lot of very explicit rules like cash cover and leverage, et cetera, that make it difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. But I mean, one thing I would say is I have been encouraged, over the recent years. There does seem to be a regulatory movement towards maybe looking at loosening some of those requirements. Or, first we had the alternative mutual fund amendments to 81102, which, opens up, funds that, can leverage with, certain things around them. There's some recent exemptive relief that has been granted to some issuers to kind of maybe invest in more alternative strategies, more kind of private vehicles. Again, not necessarily always applies to investment fund issuers, but there are periodically revisiting some of the prospectus exemptions that are out there to kind of look at expanding those. So, I don't know what the regulator's thinking or what the future has in store, but I think maybe some of that is starting to kind of percolate there, that, maybe the long only equity fund model, which is basically what 81102 was designed for, doesn't really work, 25 years later.
Well for a long time. And it didn't matter for the last 10 years what you were invested in, frankly, but it matters now. And a lot of people are hurting. So it's unfortunate that it's still so restrictive.
But I mean, even us being PIMCO being a fixed income shop, the rules aren't really designed with fixed income in mind. It's almost clear the drafters, way back when, were thinking of equity funds. So it's always required a bit of innovative thinking and trying to get at, well, what does this restriction really mean? Again, I think I am encouraged that maybe the regulators are kind of moving in that direction of realizing, some of the shackles might be a little too tight.
I feel the same way as well. I am optimistic that we're moving in the right direction. Maybe if we can go faster, that'll be even better. But yeah, with CI has the crypto ETFs. That's first in the North America. So they are a bit more forward thinking. And then I think Mo was alluding to interval funds maybe, where they are looking at allowing a retail wrapper on a alternative fund. But yeah, I agree with Caitlin at the same time, is still not enough. We should loosen those up a little bit more. But I do find that they are more susceptible to having these conversations. I've had a few of these when we were launching the crypto funds, and some of the things that we were shackled with, because it is a little different. We have a digital assets custodian, but they were open. They were open to being educated and learning as we go along at the same time. So that's my little spiel on. I'm hopeful, but let's hope it goes a little faster.
Yeah, and I would second Elsa's point there. I think at least the investment funds branch at the OSC now is a lot more open to those kinds of conversations, and kind of hearing about from the industry.
Well, is that your old branch?
It is. Little plug for my old colleagues.
Well, and I think it's important to acknowledge that while yes, they are open, I think the pandemic has, and certainly the new virtual asset class, just broadly using that terminology, the speed at which the market evolves and products and creativity is evolving really necessitates a revisit by the regulator to really look at their model and sort of say, okay, am I regulating all of it, right? Because remember, they're regulating the product, the people who manage the product, the distribution of the product. I mean, every facet is being regulated. And when you look at some of the other regulatory models, they're really focused on the people who manage it and distribute it. And so you have more freedom of the product itself. There's still a bit of parameters, but not so constrained where we're basically saying, oh, if you're targeting client A, B, C, or D, here's, you know, all of your product constraints. And I think at risk to the Canadian sort of economy and marketplace, which we know is largely driven off financial services after manufacturing, it's really important that we become far more nimble than what we are in the regulatory sense I'm talking, because otherwise the money and the creativity flows elsewhere, right? Whether that's Europe or the US or wherever. So that's important to recognize.
Thank you, Jackie. And the one last question, knowing that we're in the last 4 minutes, we talked a bit about how sometimes external counsel's advice to you has been sometimes with rosy glasses or not as practical. To the extent that external counsel, or frankly other types of service providers are listening to you now, what advice would you give them to really add the most value to this group?
Are you asking me?
Opening it to I mean, feel free, Caitlin, to go, but really anyone. It's because it is, you know, you want the service providers to really have to think in what adds the most value to you.
The service providers are the best if they are plugged into what's happening in the market and what is a market standard in whatever capacity they're providing a service. It's that simple. If they're off market, it's a fight to get them back there. And I was picking on lawyers only because I was needing a lot of advice recently with a fund. And I know, you know, the person I'm talking to is brilliant. I'm not disagreeing with that. But this person is not connected to what's actually happening on the ground. So I have to try and bridge that gap. And that is difficult to do.
Yeah, I'd say probably one of my most frequent calls to counsel is, what is the market standard on this, or what are your other clients like? What's going on? Because these are questions where, as we've mentioned many times on this talk, there's not necessarily an objectively right or wrong answer, but there is kind of a market standard and then the outliers, and you don't want to be an outlier. So I think to Catherine's point, like having a counsel that's really plugged in is critical.
Mm-hmm.
And if we've had this in the past, like, so we trust our external quite a lot because she is practical and is very plugged in. And a lot of times the next conversation becomes, do you know if your clients want to go in an exemption with us? And then you get a group exemption goes in, and you know there's magic in numbers, right? The more numbers there are, the more willing the OSU will be willing to accept and listen to it.
And less cost.
Exactly. Yeah, divide by 5.
Yeah, and I would say one last thing to add to that, because some counsel, as plugged in as they may be, don't realize that they are also making sort of risk determinations and assumptions. And I think it's important that you have a relationship with your counsel, that they understand your organization's appetite for risk in whatever particular area that might be, because there's nothing worse than getting the generic sort of response and you say, that's great, but you already know our limitations. You know, our board is extremely risk averse, or you know that our back office, as Caitlin said, they're totally like, they're incapable of doing this type of thing. So yeah, what can I do to still achieve these things? And it's just, you need them to be kind of wedded to you almost. And I don't mean that in a relationship, but fundamentally understanding your organization's sort of limits and boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you to all of you for all the contributions. We're almost at time, and there was a lot to talk about reducing the regulatory burden, and we said we'll leave that for our next session. But certainly appreciate your tips for service providers as well, because doing what you're paying them to do is sort of the least you expect. But when they put that hat on about what are we learning that we can share with you that makes your life easier, is so important. That we certainly encounter that on the translation side as well. As you can expect, it's not just here's the documents, but also what are you seeing out there that can make my process seem easier. So that can be a takeaway for any service providers that were listening. So thank you all. I promise to keep this sharp at 2 p.m. and look forward to the encore in the new year.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you very much.
you.